So I'm personally of the opinion that it is difficult to pinpoint a singular starting point for Anabaptism, since it has what's called a polygenesis, meaning many beginnings. And the political tensions of the day were fueling tensions among church communities everywhere. Forms of Anabaptism are being practiced in Germany, Moravia, and Switzerland. This could be a disputed point, but it's one I hold confidently, but also with an open hand. Anabaptists got their name because, according to the state religions of the time, Anabaptists were rebaptizing their followers. It was the norm at the churches of the day to do infant baptism. What was actually happening was that Anabaptists came to their own theology and conclusion that baptism should be a consensual choice for an adult of age. This belief, along with a strong conviction of keeping church and state separate, radical equality and communal living, made the Anabaptists a target in the eyes of the institutional church of the day. Multiple communities across European countries came to conclusions similar to Anabaptists. In fact, it was a label that government authorities landed on any Christian group that believed in adult baptism and disassociation from the state churches. So due to this polygenesis, there is much debate over which group is considered theologically Anabaptists versus what the authorities labeled as Anabaptists. So Mennonites are a sect of Anabaptism that began among the Swiss communities, and it was started by a former Catholic priest named Menno Simons. Simons was a former Catholic priest who converted to Anabaptism after a period of deconstruction. So at this point, Anabaptists were a splintered movement, particularly after a disastrous peasants' revolt. And Menno's leadership helped to solidify it and give it a prominent voice, and helped it provide the boundaries for which the Anabaptists were to follow. So from his leadership and teaching came the Mennonites. So after several hundred years of perpetual persecution, Mennonites fled to both Canada and the colonial United States eventually. So what distinguishes Mennonites from classic Western Christianity is the special emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount and the Gospels. We don't consider ourselves a creedal faith. We instead look at the life and teachings of Jesus and try to apply them directly to our own lives. Whereas you find in most Protestant and evangelical traditions, and this is painting with a very broad brush, I'm understanding that, but there's a particular focus is found on the letters of the New Testament, particularly the ones that Paul wrote, specifically Romans, for example. Mennonites and Anabaptists, instead, as I mentioned before, look at the way Jesus lived, and then we try to copy likewise. So, and that's how we interpret Scripture through that lens. So this form of interpretation is called cruciform hermeneutics, which means cross-shaped biblical interpretation. So we look at it, the entirety of the Bible, through the lens of self-sacrificial love. While to the non-Christian this may seem like a clearer route to take because Christian is supposed to follow Jesus, most systematic theology is developed in the letters of the New Testament, particularly Paul's letters. So the following Jesus literally cost the early Anabaptists their lives during the Radical Reformation and continued on for hundreds of years. Part of the reason why Anabaptism was so difficult to develop in their beginnings was because theologians and preachers would be martyred before the theology had a chance to really take root. So they continue to face oppression in some parts of the world for holding on to a peace witness. The German term for Mennonites for submitting to Jesus' teachings in life, in all areas of life, is a hard-to-translate word called, pardon my German, Geselligkeit. Among the Mennonite distinctions are a dedication to community living, Christian nonviolence, simplicity, and radical hospitality. And that hard-to-translate word simply means, well, it doesn't simply mean anything in English, but it does mean submission and yielding to the Spirit of God. So we have a particular emphasis on community living, Christian nonviolence, simplicity, and radical hospitality. So because of this culture of service and social justice, Mennonites are actually predominant in the fields of medicine, human rights, ministry, and nonprofit work. Out of any U.S. American denomination, we have the most people out there on the field. So my own denomination, Mennonite Church USA, holds roots in Swiss and German Anabaptism. And there's another group that's prominent in the United States called the Mennonite Brethren. And they hold roots to Ukrainian heritage, and they tend to be more evangelical in their theology. So my second influence is Quakerism. The Quaker tradition, though commonly lumped into Anabaptism, did not come from the same radical Reformation that the Mennonites came from. Quakerism came from the disillusioned spiritual journey of a cobbler named George Fox 100 years after Anabaptism began, so this was about the 1650s. So he was someone who was in his early 20s, and he went forward to every clergy person he could to find a reason why he could not personally connect to God. And some of the answers are kind of hilarious. He's like, one pastor told him that you need to smoke some more cigars. Another pastor told him that you just need to get married. And no matter where he went, you can't just find that void to be filled. But one day when he was out in the fields praying, Fox felt the voice of God say there was one but Christ Jesus that could speak to that condition. So as a result of this, Fox realized that there was no need for intermediaries in connection to God, and he could be accessed directly. So from the spiritual revelation came a mystic Christian tradition that believes that all of humanity has the light of Christ within them, that visions of social equity and justice are in line with Christian practice, and a special attention and focus on God being present in the everydayness of life and silence is especially emphasized. Quaker values can be best summed up in the acronym SPICES, which is very common in Quaker culture. This spells out simplicity, peace, integrity, community, equality, and stewardship. As I mentioned before, it's disputed about whether or not Quakerism can technically be lapped into the Anabaptist family, despite Quakers and Anabaptists having a close relationship over the 20th and 21st centuries. It's a minority opinion that Quakerism is Anabaptist, but that theory is still there. There's a strain of Anabaptism called spiritualist Anabaptism that began in the Radical Reformation that often had ideas similar to Quakerism. So it could be argued that Anabaptism provided the soil from which Quakerism could grow. For instance, the idea of the light of Christ being within all humanity is found in the Anabaptist mystic Hans Denk's work. He wrote, "One perceives a little spark of this love in a few people, and some more than in others. Although in most people of our time it is regrettably extinguished, nevertheless, since love is spiritual and people are carnal, it is certain that this spark, however small it is in man, is not of man, but has come from a place of perfect love. This love is God." Dan also has another quote that summarizes this Anabaptist mysticism well. He says, "No one can truly know Christ unless he follows him in daily life." So that quote is often repeated in Mennonite circles as a way to describe the holistic way we approach faith. So another interesting historical fact to note is that the Mennonites and Quakers shared a church and worshiped together in the early colonies in Germantown, Pennsylvania. They eventually split because the Mennonites wanted traditional clergy, whereas Quakers were radical and didn't have formal clergy. What would happen is that the Quakers would gather together and they would have what's called, in today's terms, unprogrammed worship, where they would wait in silence for divine revelations. But anyway, they split because the Mennonites eventually just didn't go with that same flow of service. But it was at that church that slavery was actually first denounced by an institution in United States history. Interestingly, in my Quaker Studies track, they said it was the Quakers that first denounced slavery. But in my Anabaptist Studies track, they said it was the Mennonites who first denounced it. So history reveals that both of these groups influenced each other within that same congregation. And perhaps it's the peacemaker in me that wants to settle the issue with nuance. So this is also a little note about how this presentation will go. As you'll find out, there is no universal one way to celebrate Christmas. I am drawing from my own Anabaptism and Quakerism for my conclusions, but I'm going to be presenting the history in brief as I understood it and read it. And I'm also informed by various liberation theologies. So I have come to a new conclusion, well, not new, but I've come to a conclusion on how Christians and all other faith expressions can celebrate and partake in the Christmas season. But being a good Anabaptist, I want to first start with the Gospels. So the traditional nativity, or the birth of Christ story, was written as a way to subvert the empire of the day. While I personally believe in the traditional interpretation of Mary's virgin birth, a reader does not need to believe in a literal virgin birth to understand the political and social context of what was going on. This was during the time of Pax Romana, meaning Roman peace. This is a philosophy the Roman Empire used to justify conquering and taking over other lands. According to some scholars, the way the Roman Empire would conquer land is similar to how genocide is enacted today. To keep the Jewish population under control, Romans would often publicly execute anyone who was seen as dissenters. For those familiar with the old Kirk Douglas movie Spartacus, the ending scene of the slave army being crucified long down the road actually happened. And that was a regular occurrence for the Roman army to put down anyone that was seen as a threat, or to even just to show off their might and strength. So in comes Jesus into the story. So divinity was closely wrapped up in being a ruler of the day. There was on the back of every coin that Caesar is Lord, for example, right? So here comes Jesus, and there's a promise that God will send a Messiah to show a different way and liberate the oppressed. The nativity is scandalous in that the heavens preferred a lower class Jewish girl over an earthly ruler to be a receiver of divine favor. In the theology of the day, marginalized groups are not supposed to receive divine favor. And the nativity reveals a truth that God cares about the poor and the people that are marginalized. This is seen in Mary's response to Elizabeth telling her she was pregnant. In the Christian tradition, we call this following section the Magnificat. This is found in Luke 1, 46 to 55. I'm reading from the Common English Bible. This is in response to her cousin recognizing Jesus in her robe. Mary said, "With all my heart I glorify the Lord. In the depths of who I am, I rejoice in God my Savior. He has looked favor on the low status of his servant. Look, from now on everyone will consider me highly favored, because the Mighty One has done great things for me. Holy is his name. He shows mercy to everyone, from one generation to the next, who honors him as God. He has shown strength with his arm, and he has scattered those with arrogant thoughts and proud inclinations. He has pulled the powerful down from the thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent away the rich empty-handed. He has come to the aid of his servant Israel, remembering his mercy, just as he promised to our ancestors, to Abraham and to Abraham's descendants forever." The scandal of Jesus entering into humanity, the extraordinary breaking through to the ordinary, is that God is not presented as this cruel leader or dictator, as was the practice in the Roman religions of the time. The kingdom of heaven, according to Jesus, was not found in glory and violence, but in the humility of shepherds and children. Jesus being born this way communicated a powerful political message that the spiritual realm was against the kingdoms of the world and their cruelty. King Herod, in response to hearing about Jesus' birth, as the story goes, orders every baby to be slaughtered in Bethlehem. And as a response, Jesus' parents become refugees and flee to Egypt. So Nativity focuses on Bethlehem, on marginalized groups of people that neither Rome nor traditional Jewish culture at the time would have paid any attention to. There were shepherds who first noticed the sign, who were considered lowly workers that were ritually filthy. There were astrologists in the east, around the region of Erbil, Iraq. And them noticing that the Messiah was coming was a huge indicator that God was more universal and inclusive than was previously thought. So why was Jesus entering the picture? If you were to ask the early church up until about 1000 AD, the purpose of Jesus coming down to earth was to overcome the powers and principalities of the world, to conquer the cruel ways of the governments and powers. In theological terms, this is known as Christus Victor, i.e. Christ declaring victory over the powers of evil through love and self-sacrifice, with forgiveness for sin being a part of the picture, but not the entirety of it. So the sole emphasis in the cross being about the forgiveness of sin came from Protestant reinterpretations, and more especially evangelicalism, which would develop in the United States. So this is one of many atonement theories about why Jesus came to earth and died, but this is the one I find the most biblical consistency in. And the reason for my own conviction in Christus Victor is looking at the political and social context in which Jesus was born. He revealed that the way of God was not found through violence and conquering the other, but through radical love and self-sacrifice. And Christian tradition shares that through his resurrection, God had the final say on the cruel things of the world. It is in this fulfillment of Advent that Christians continue to wait in eager anticipation when all things will be made new. So here's some Christmas in brief. There's 2,000 years of history, so obviously I'm going to be skipping over a few things. But there's no scriptural mandate to celebrate Christmas. Only 2 Gospels discuss the birth of Christ specifically. Scholars do not believe that December 25th is Jesus' actual birthday. In fact, birthdays carry little significance in the early church. So where did the holiday and observance come from? The early evidence we have so far that early Christians observed some form of Christmas is from Julius I in 300-ish AD. He declared that December 25th was to be the day the Nativity was celebrated. This was after Christianity was officially recognized and legalized by Constantine after 300 years of living under perpetual persecution. But even then, in early church documents, we come across a letter in 389 AD from the Archbishop of Constantinople that cautioned people against celebrating Christmas because of dancing and feasting to excess. This is a common understanding that Christmas was formed as a missionary attempt to pagan Europe, but there's actually little to no evidence of that. However, in ancient Rome, there were 3 festivals clustered around this day. Christmas studies scholar Judith Flanders writes in her book Christmas Biography that Saturnalia, when religious offerings were made to Saturn, the god of agriculture, began on December 17th and lasted for 7 days. Work ceased, shops closed, gifts of candles were given, and gambling, eating, and drinking prevailed. The holiday was followed by Calends, a secular civic New Year festival, officially from January 1st to the 3rd, but often unofficially continuing to January 5th. Buildings are decorated in greenery, and people ate, drank, and watched races and processions, while small tokens, wreaths, and garlands or lamps inscribed happiness in the new year were exchanged. So around the time Christianity became legalized in the Roman Empire, a holiday celebrating the birth of another god named Sol Invictus was pretty common. This was always celebrated around the winter solstice. As can be seen, there was already a cultural posture towards celebrating his birth around what we now consider to be Christmas season. But meanwhile, in Eastern Christianity, there was a celebration called Epiphany that did celebrate Christ's birth. However, the focus was not primarily on the actual birth itself, but on Jesus' baptism that would come when he was 30 years old. The culmination of all these factors led to Christmas within the church being celebrated from December 25th to January 6th as one continual holiday. So, however, because of the cultural roots of this new holiday, it was less of a religious celebration than it was an excuse to celebrate and entertain. By the time the Middle Ages came around, the holiday was primarily marked with drinking, gambling, and giving gifts. To give a brief summary of literal hundreds of years of Christmas celebration, it was filled with reasons to be entertained. There was less and less about the nativity. There was less religious observance. And as the centuries went on, more and more Christmas customs that are popular and celebrated today became more mainstream practice. So here are a few key notes from that history. The first Christmas hymns written and performed within the church were in the 4th century. However, Christmas carols, as we've come to know them, started around the 12th century. Then in the 13th and 14th centuries, Christmas carols became a regular part of holiday celebration, mainly focusing on the celebration part rather than the actual religious observance. Francis of Assisi, a renowned Catholic reformer, was the first to historically produce replicas of a stable with a manger, an ox, and a donkey in 1223. And the first recognized Christmas tree was put up in 1605 in Strasbourg in southwest Germany. By the time the Christmas comes to the colonies, it is a day marked technically by religious observance, but in actuality was used as an excuse to drink and cause mayhem. Which brings us to how it is celebrated in the United States. Christmas, as the U.S. has come to celebrate, is a fairly new phenomenon in the grander scheme of church history. In the colonial era, Christmas was outright banned by the majority of Christians. The reason for this is that because people would take advantage of the season and use it as an excuse to vandalize property and go on days-long drinking binges. A tradition that is similar to trick-or-treating happened in the colonies every Christmas season, where residents who did not celebrate Christmas in the same way often ended up with their houses on fire. In fact, it was one of the few points that the Puritans and Quakers agreed on, the Puritans being a much more conservative sect of Christianity in the colonies. Christmas was dangerous and should not be celebrated. In Quaker doctrine specifically, there was also a theological underpinning to this that argued that since every day was holy, it was sacrilegious to especially be celebrating Christmas, because it was denying God's goodness on all the other days. The Puritan minister Reverend increased Mather wrote in 1687, "The generality of Christmas keepers observe that festival after such a manner as is highly dishonorable to the name of Christ. How few are there comparatively to those that spend those holidays, as they are called, after a holy manner. But they are consumed in competitions and interludes, in playing at cards and revelings, and excess of wine, and mad mirth." So public perceptions towards Christmas weren't exactly positive. But there was a shift starting the later 1700s with the Unitarian churches being the first ones as church bodies to celebrate Christmas in an ethical and lighthearted way. But really the big shift to celebrate Christmas came not from the churches, but from consumerism and capitalism. As attitudes softened towards Christmas, gift giving became more of the norm. The first big Christmas gifts to give loved ones were books or anthologies. For publishing history, this is particularly interesting. The reason why the anthology was invented as a form was for Christmas gift giving. So one of the major voices to bring life to Christmas was actually Charles Dickens in the late 1800s. He set out to write a story that would convict people to care for those stuck in systems of poverty. The result was A Christmas Carol. And at the time of its release, people were disturbed and moved by the plight of the poor as was displayed in the story. The impact was so great that a clergyman at Charles Dickens' funeral called A Christmas Carol the greatest sermon on charity ever preached. In the subsequent years, Dickens released 4 more Christmas-themed novellas. The next installment, The Chimes, was about goblins on New Year's Eve, showing a person the value of life, even in poverty. And interestingly, The Chimes, for those who read Dickens, is one of the few stories that Dickens does not wrap up things neatly in. Instead, he intended to challenge the readers to act more. The response to that novella was not quite as well received, thus making the next installment, The Cricket on the Hearth, a light-hearted love story with Christmas themes. The next installments, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man and The Ghost's Bargain, were not as popular either. But these stories were read regularly around the fire with family gatherings, and Dickens is credited as the man who invented Christmas. Despite him discontinuing his novellas after some time, he continued to write short stories for families to read and gather around, and they were released around the same time yearly. So in the West, Christmas continued to evolve, eventually turning more and more into an accepted national holiday. Coca-Cola invented our modern conceptions of Santa Claus in the North Pole. While Santa Claus was supposed to be based on St. Nicholas, who lived around 300 AD, the modern conception of him has little to no resemblance to the actual figure. Our conception of Christmas elves came from appropriated stereotypes of Sami tribes found around Scandinavia and Russia. So it's really interesting then that in a lot of sects of Christianity and a culture war that is being perceived, there was a big push against what's perceived to be taking Christ out of Christmas. But as we see through history, keeping Christ in Christmas has always been the issue. And it's a myth that Christmas has always been celebrated the same ways, indeed warmly, by the church. I view these things as challenges and opportunities. Here are the facts. Christmas, as the American West currently celebrates, is a form of consumerism. It should be noted once again that there is no scriptural mandate to celebrate Christmas. And in fact, one of the many reasons why it was not celebrated was in the colonies. In fact, it could also be argued that the same social ills plaguing the colonies can be found in our own contexts. The funding of war through consumerism, the support of sweatshop slavery, growing income inequality, and systemic racism still plaguing our country all manifest in how the American West still celebrates Christmas. The challenge then is to take the biblical narrative of subverting empire and apply it to our own contexts, and then ask ourselves, basically, as childish as it seems on the surface, how would Jesus want his birthday celebrated? So, switching a bit to my tradition, Anabaptism and Quakerism. Anabaptists do not have an official Christmas theology, but like everything else, the attempt to practice it simply in a way that does not bring pride can be seen in various strands of it. In Amish communities, and Amish broke off from the Mennonites in the mid-1800s. And their theology is hard to solve as well because each community is different and their practices are different. Christmas is usually not celebrated elaborately though. They will not have Christmas trees or decorations in their homes. They'll usually have their own forms of celebration and attending worship services and singing hymns with other Amish friends and family. The same is true in more traditional Mennonite homes where simplicity is placed as a higher value. From my own readings on the matter, it is similar to Amish celebrations in that some homes will not have Christmas trees or decorations. However, they will gather with friends and family and sing hymns. In the past, there was a more complicated portrait. Anabaptists are what are called a low church tradition, meaning that they rely basically on equality and no hierarchy, right? So there was a lot of debate whether or not to adopt the church calendar as came from the institutional church of the day. The Global Anabaptist Mennonite Encyclopedia Online shares that among the older Mennonite churches in America, Good Friday, Ascension, and Pentecost were no longer observed, except for possibly using the day for special programs unrelated to the real meaning of the day. And seldom was Christmas Day observed at the church services. In Ontario, there was more of an observance of such days, except by the Old Order Amish. The observance of all or part of Passion Week by special church services grew among Mennonites in the mid-20th century. The Old Order Amish have retained more of their older traditions, manifest a different pattern. They celebrated a second Christmas on January 6th, in addition to December 25th, known in German as Alt Christtag, or Old Christmas. They celebrate this day, as well as Good Friday, Ascension, and Pentecost with fasting, i.e. omitting breakfast but without church services, and followed by visiting friends and family on these days. Pentecost Monday and Easter Monday are also observed as holidays, but with visiting only and not fasting. As was explained earlier, Quakers have a complicated relationship with Christmas. As the centuries went on, Quakers became more comfortable with the movement. With the introduction of evangelicalism into the Quaker mainstream, Christmas did not become the controversial holiday as once thought. In fact, as early as the 1780s, there was evidence that at least some Quakers were becoming warm to the idea of Christmas, as marked by the diary of a famous Quaker named Elizabeth Drinker. George Fox, in his journal, however, observes this one instance where he's looking at on a party of wealthy people celebrating Christmas. And then there's this telling moment when he looks to the side and he looks at a beggar on the street. And he is drawn by the divine to go towards the beggar to be present with him. If Christmas was as rambunctiously celebrated in England in the 1600s as it was in the colonies, his reaction makes so much more sense. So what is at the core of Anabaptist and Quaker concern with celebrating Christmas historically? It is that the spirit of kindness, generosity of Christ is often skipped over and used as another excuse to focus on consumerism or to be selfish. To uphold the consistent peace witnesses, both Anabaptists and Quakers historically seriously re-examined how to celebrate the holiday. As time went on, Christmas became mainstream for both Mennonites and Quakers. It is common today to walk into a Quaker meeting house during a season and see a Christmas tree up. This would have given the original Quakers quite a shock. So what about these concerns are still relevant today, not only for Christians, but for all people? As of the presentation today, there is a human recognized genocide in Gaza, a perpetual onslaught war and destruction in Ukraine. As I mentioned before, outright racism is on the rise again, with Nazis openly marching the street in some corners of the United States. The goods we buy directly fund weapons of war. There's also a loneliness epidemic within the West. Climate change especially becomes an issue over Christmas season. Every holiday season, an estimated 1 million tons of waste are produced each week. Approximately 7 million tons of food are wasted every Christmas season. For those doing quick math, that's the equivalent of 2 million turkeys, 5 million Christmas puddings, and 74 million mince pies. So whether or not you're a Christian, this applies to everyone. The way that Christmas is being celebrated is bringing a bit more harm than intended. How then can the Christmas holiday be reformed towards public good? And is there a theology for that? My idea is classically Anabaptist in that we go back to the Gospels to see what the birth narrative reveals to us about how we should live. But there are also some key helpful figures that drew light on best how to approach the holiday. The following are based on my own reflections and findings after years of meditation. There was a poet and theologian named Howard Thurman, who was a Black Christian mystic in the Baptist tradition, whose work was primarily published in the early to mid 20th century. Thurman is primarily known for his works around liberation theology, including a famous book called Jesus and the Disinherited. Thurman's theology would influence and was seen as monumental in the civil rights movement, and he played a key role as a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. Thurman's mysticism was influenced by Quakerism. In fact, the publishing house that released all of his work was through Friends United Press, which was a service of the Quaker denomination Friends United meeting. Thurman was also mentored by Rufus Jones, and is clearly seen in Thurman's own theology. So Rufus Jones, in brief, was a professor, theologian, and religious scholar from the broad Quaker tradition. He is most notably known for helping to start the peacemaking and humanitarian nonprofit organization, American Friends Service Committee. The idea behind the organization was to form something out of religious commitment that did not force itself on other faiths or cultures. The American Friends Service Committee would go on to win a Nobel Peace Prize in 1947 for their efforts in securing safe passage for several thousand Jewish refugees from Nazi Germany throughout the 1930s and into World War II. So where Thurman's Quaker mysticism shines through is in his theology of Christmas. He writes in The Mood of Christmas that the true meaning of Christmas is expressed in the sharing of one's graces in a world in which it is so easy to become callous and sensitive and hard. Once the Spirit becomes a part of a man's life, every day is Christmas, and every night is frightened with anticipation of the dawning of fresh and perhaps holy adventure. Thurman is drawing on clear Quaker roots in these ideas, and the key phrase that reveals this is every day is Christmas. In Quaker theology, as we've explored earlier, one of the reasons Christmas was not originally celebrated was because of the sense that every day is sacred. Thurman takes that Quaker idea and reverses it and says that there's a lot of beauty about Christmas that we can consider into our everyday practice. He recognizes that the imagery of Christmas and Nativity offer a glimpse into what is possible for the making of a better world. God is not found in the wealthy and powerful, but in a terrified refugee couple fleeing Bethlehem. For Thurman, it is through the ordinary horror that the extraordinary hope breaks through and offers all people a chance for justice and redemption. His poetry reveals these strong themes too. In his most famous Christmas poem, The Work of Christmas, he wrote, "When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flocks, the work of Christmas begins. To find the lost, to heal the broken, to feed the hungry, to release the prisoner, to rebuild the nations, to bring peace among the people, and to make music in the heart." Thurman also wrote in The Mood of Christmas about the symbology of the holiday. He wrote, "The symbol of Christmas, what is it? It is a rainbow arched over the roof of the sky when clouds are heavy and foreboding. It is the cry of life from the newborn babe. When forest fills up mother's nests, it claims the right to life. It is the brooding presence of the eternal spirit making crooked ways straight and rough places smooth. Tired hearts refreshed, dead hopes stirred with newness of life. It is the promise of tomorrow at the close of every day, the movement of life in defiance of death, and the assurance that love is sturdier than hate, that right is more confident than wrong, that good is more permanent than evil." So just because Christmas has been celebrated in some ways that bring harm, there are still themes from it that can be redeemed, right? It does not detract from the beauty and awe of the radical message of liberation and hope that Nativity offers in the biblical accounts. In fact, I would argue that U.S. American Christians need Advent and a more reformed Christmas to remind them that life is more than their own existence. In the ancient account, we are forced to see God in the marginalized, to see that the kingdom of heaven has come, and that invites us to do good work alongside God. Later in life, when Jesus is asked what his own message is in the Gospel of Luke, he quotes the passage from Isaiah 61, 1 through 2, and 58, 6. This passage in the Gospel of Luke reads, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me. He has sent me to preach good news to the poor, to proclaim release to the prisoners, and recovery of sight to the blind, to liberate the oppressed, and to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So, it seems that the best way to observe Christmas, the way Jesus would intend it, is to do exactly those things. Serve at homeless shelters, invite homeless youth who are estranged from family to a dinner table, advocate for the prisoner, be present for the hurting, take time to visit hospitals, and work for a better world for all of humanity. In Christmas movies and stories, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, these themes are always highlighted, yet there still seems to be a disconnect between practice and belief. Charles Dickens could be thanked primarily for this theme of turning from greed to love, from disconnection to connection. However, being a mystic at heart, I see God at work in the way stories are told. I believe it's in our spiritual DNA to look for the divine in our stories. For instance, the 1946 movie It's a Wonderful Life is about the moral cost of charity and conscience. The main character, George Bailey, as played by James Stewart, gives up his dream of travel and a luxurious life to work at his father's community development project, to give housing to underprivileged folks and immigrants. As a result, he is not rewarded for his good deeds, but he's punished by the banker and wealthiest man in town, Mr. Potter. This puts him into a suicidal depression after a perceived failure in his own life. That is when Clarence, an angel sent by God, comes down to earth to show George that the fruits of his life are not found in his successes, but in the ways he showed up for a small community. This movie was actually not that well received when it first came out. But what's interesting is that it really did find its life over cable television. The reason why it developed its own reputation and success was because people found themselves feeling what George felt. That the entirety of their value was not based on who they were created to be, but on the lack of what they produced. The movie and story gave them hope to continue living. The challenge of It's a Wonderful Life is summed up beautifully in K.B. Hoyle's article in Christ and Pop Culture, called George Bailey at the Bridge, The Costly Virtue of It's a Wonderful Life. She writes, "What does costly virtue look like? Costly virtue sometimes does look like brokenness. When we practice virtue, we might find ourselves as George weeping at a bar. In practicing costly virtue, we imitate Christ, who is no stranger to giving all he had in service to others. To giving all he had to not just hold back evil, but to defeat it. When we find ourselves broken because of the cost of our virtue, that is also an invitation to Christ, who wept and sweated blood in the garden. It probably won't look like giving up our lives, for most of us in the West. But George Bailey gives us a good picture of what it might look like for the average struggling person. Giving the last dollars when we need it for ourselves. Forgoing that vacation we've saved every last penny for. Sacrificing our long life dreams. The world says we are nothing if we don't live for ourselves. But God says we must die to ourselves in order to live. Like George Bailey, we may never leave our hometown. But if we're not willing to give ourselves for the communities in which God has placed us, what will be the cost of the absence of our virtue? So this is a much celebrated story, and it's in the U.S. American public conscience. The giving of ourselves, the self-sacrifice, the idea of being holistically present for our communities in which God has placed us. These are all ideas and themes already present in the Nativity. The movement of the Spirit, I believe, is towards justice, love, and peace. And that especially comes out in Christmas stories. George Bailey's struggle against despair and greed is congruent with the call and struggle of the good news that Jesus preached. To encourage people to celebrate Christmas in a way that honors all of life and walks a radical path of love in an era of despair and fear is to connect them to the way that God is already present in the world. It is to show people that the path to peace is not found through conquering the other, but in genuine connection, relationships, and service. This is the practice of hope and resurrection in the face of cruelty of the world. So in my own ideal version of the world, this would be the norm for U.S. American Christians. This year, being a bit of a hypocrite, I started to finally initiate my own ethics this year and actually invite and open my home to those who have no family for Christmas. But if you do not celebrate Christmas this year, I would strongly encourage you to seek volunteer opportunities or connect with those in isolation. Mental health problems and loneliness are felt especially this year. And I also want to recognize my own unique privilege speaking on this as a white Christian. The church has historically harmed the world, and I fully own that. And I believe it's the calling of every Christian to live into repentance for past and current wrongs. That being said, U.S. American Christians need to be especially reminded of the gospel's basic call to serve the poor and to be present for the marginalized. Because of cultural Christianity and Christian nationalism, that basic message has been lost. I would encourage anyone, no matter what your faith or lack of faith is, to evangelize to us Christians, or remind us what path we are claiming to follow. We need to be reminded of it now more than ever. And while there has not been a consistent Christmas celebration throughout church history, acts of love and charity during the season can still be found in some earlier theologians. Isaac of Nineveh, for instance, wrote a beautiful prayer about nativity around the 7th century. He wrote, "This Christmas night bestowed peace on the whole world, so let no one threaten. This is the night of the most gentle one, let no one be cruel. This is the night of the humble one, let no one be proud. Now is the day of joy, let us not revenge. Now is the day of goodwill, let us not be mean. In this day of peace, let us not be conquered by anger. Today the bountiful impoverished himself for our sake. So rich one, invite the poor to your table. Today we receive a gift for which we did not ask. So let us give alms to those who implore and beg us. This present day cast open the heavenly doors to our prayers. Let us open our doors to those who ask for our forgiveness. Today the divine being took upon himself the seal of our humanity, in order for humanity to be decorated by the seal of divinity." So whenever the season comes around, there's always that uproar from certain segments of the Christian community that Christ has been, got a little too excited there, that Christ has been removed from Christmas. But what has been found in my own searching is that God cannot be taken up anywhere. Otherwise, he is not God. However, the gospel message of service to the marginalized and love in the face of hatred can absolutely be diluted and twisted. So it's time at least for Christians to claim this message and for our religious siblings to hold us accountable. During this time of anxiety and uncertainty, this way of celebrating Christmas is needed. I'm reminded of the story behind the famous Christmas hymn, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." In the late 1800s, there was a man named Charles Appleton Longfellow who was married for about 18 years before his wife suddenly passed on in an accidental fire. He was also burned severely, and he was unable to attend his own wife's funeral because of it. The very first Christmas he celebrated without his wife was miserable. And he wrote in his journal, "A Merry Christmas, say the children, the bed is no more for me." Soon his son joined the Union Army against Charles's wishes as a pacifist. Charles had also seen war and tried to have his own son stay out of it. What ended up happening was that his own son got shot in such a way that Charles was told that his son would be paralyzed. Recovery would take about 6 months. But that year during Christmas, there was nothing recorded in his journal. However, in 1864, something unique happened. As Charles was sitting in New Hope Church, he heard bells in the background and a song being sung about peace. Something within him stirred. He immediately grabbed his journal and wrote something that would later on become a timeless song. He wrote, "I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and loud and sweet the words repeat, of peace on earth and goodwill to men." I thought how, as the day had come, the belfries of all Christendom had rolled all along the unbroken song of peace on earth and goodwill to men. So reigning, singing on its way, the world revolved from night to day, a voice that chimed, a chant sublime, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then from each black accursed mouth, cannon thundered in the south, and with a sound the carols drowned, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. It was as if an earthquake rent the hearthstones of a continent, and made forlorn the households born, of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth and goodwill to men. Then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. Hearing the bells made Charles realize that God was still with him, even in his pain, even in the ugliness of the darkness and war surrounding him. Charles saw the divine through hearing the bells. This would later be adapted to a song by Bing Crosby that became popular over the airwaves and is played constantly every Christmas season. So the Nativity points to us that no matter how seemingly insignificant our small acts of goodness may seem, they ripple throughout eternity. The kingdom of heaven is found in everyday kindness and small, still moments where God is mysteriously still present. So may we all practice this type of sinking, May we all practice this type of seeking, no matter what our faith practice is. And let us always be humble enough to see God in the refugee, the child caught in war zones, the single mother on the run, immigrants, and most of our own neighbors. And let us always be reminded of the main message of Christmas and Nativity whenever we hear church bells in the distance, and continue to foster peace on earth and goodwill to all. Thank you. Until this.